This person knew they cared about you from the very first moment they saw you. My beloved child. This person knew they cared about you from the very first moment they saw you, but what frightened them was how quickly that feeling arrived. There was no long conversation, no dramatic confession, no obvious reason for their heart to react the way it did. You simply appeared, and something inside them became unusually still. They noticed your face first, but it wasn't your appearance that stayed with them. It was something in your expression, a quiet depth they couldn't explain. For a few seconds, they forgot what they were supposed to be doing. They tried to act normal, yet their eyes kept returning to you. And here is what you never saw. Later, when they were alone, they replayed that first moment in their mind. Why did a stranger suddenly feel important? Why did they already care whether you were happy, safe, or carrying something painful behind your smile? They told themselves it was simple curiosity. But deep down, they knew that wasn't true. What happened afterward made the feeling harder to dismiss. They began noticing tiny things about you that other people seemed to overlook. The way your energy changed when you became uncomfortable, the way you sometimes smiled even when something was clearly weighing on you, and the way you could be surrounded by people yet somehow appear emotionally distant. None of this should have mattered so much to them. But it did. Without realizing it, they started watching for your reactions. If you seemed happy, they felt lighter. If you seemed hurt, something inside them tightened. And that scared them because caring usually came slowly for this person. They were accustomed to protecting themselves, keeping emotional distance until someone proved they could be trusted. Yet with you, their heart seemed to break its own rules. Don't skip, because there was one particular moment when they finally understood that what they felt had begun on that very first day, and what happened in that moment changed the way they saw you completely. It happened when someone casually mentioned you in conversation. Nothing dramatic was said. Your name simply came up, and this person reacted before they could control themselves. Their attention sharpened instantly. They wanted to know where you were, how you were doing, and whether something had happened. Then they caught themselves. Why was your name enough to change their entire mood? That question followed them long after the conversation ended. And eventually, they admitted something privately that they still weren't ready to say to you. From the first moment they saw you, they had felt strangely protective of your heart. Not possessive. Not obsessive. Just deeply concerned in a way they couldn't logically explain. But there was another detail about that first encounter they had never told anyone. Something you did within those first few moments made them believe there was a hidden sadness behind your strength. And once they noticed it, they made a quiet decision about you that you still know nothing about. That quiet decision stayed hidden because this person wasn't ready to admit how deeply you had affected them. After that first encounter, they made a promise to themselves: if they ever had the chance to truly know you, they would never become another person who made you feel unseen. They had noticed something subtle in you, a brief change in your eyes when you thought nobody was paying attention. Your smile remained, your voice stayed calm, but for one tiny moment, the strength you showed everyone else seemed to disappear. That was the moment their curiosity became genuine care. They wondered what you had been carrying alone. Who had disappointed you before? Why did you seem so practiced at pretending everything was fine? And strangely, instead of wanting to walk away from that complexity, they wanted to understand it. They didn't know your whole story yet, but somehow they already wanted to protect the part of you that rarely felt safe enough to be seen. Then something unexpected began happening. Whenever they knew you might be nearby, they became more aware of everything, their words, their appearance, even the way they carried themselves. They didn't want you to notice, so sometimes they deliberately acted more distant than they actually felt. That distance may have confused you. You might even have wondered whether they cared at all. But behind that controlled behavior was someone fighting an emotion that had arrived far too early and far too strongly. They remembered small details you probably forgot mentioning. They noticed when your mood changed. And when someone spoke about you unfairly, they felt an immediate urge to defend you, even before they fully understood why. Stay till the end, because this is where their feelings crossed an invisible line. One day, they saw you giving someone else the same warmth and attention that had once made them feel special, and their reaction exposed something they had been desperately trying to hide from themselves. For the first time, they felt the possibility of losing a place in your life before they had even earned one. It wasn't anger. It was a sudden heaviness they couldn't explain away. They realized they didn't simply enjoy seeing you. They cared about what you thought of them. They cared whether you noticed their absence. They cared whether somebody else might become the person you trusted with the pieces of yourself they desperately wanted to understand. That realization frightened them enough to pull back for a while, hoping distance would weaken the feeling. Instead, the opposite happened. Your absence made everything clearer. They began remembering the exact first moment they saw you, and one detail kept returning with uncomfortable precision. It wasn't your smile. It wasn't what you were wearing. It was the way you looked directly at them for just a second, as if somehow you had recognized something in them too. And now they were beginning to wonder whether that first moment had changed both of you. For days, that possibility followed them everywhere. What if you had felt something too? They started looking backward, remembering conversations differently, questioning moments they had once dismissed as ordinary. There had been pauses where neither of you seemed eager to leave. There were times your eyes met and one of you quickly looked away. And there were small changes in your voice when you spoke directly to them, subtle enough to deny, but impossible for them to completely forget. Still, they refused to assume anything. Caring about you was already making them vulnerable, and imagining that you might care too felt even more dangerous. So they watched quietly. They listened more carefully. And instead of asking you directly, they waited for one unmistakable sign. What they didn't realize was that this waiting would eventually reveal something much bigger than attraction. That sign appeared during a moment when you weren't trying to impress anyone. You were simply being yourself, helping someone without expecting recognition. This person watched from a distance, and suddenly they understood why their feelings had started so quickly. It wasn't because you were perfect. It was because something about your character matched what they had sensed in those first few seconds. Your kindness wasn't performed. Your strength wasn't loud. And underneath both, they could still see that hidden tenderness you tried so carefully to protect. That realization hit them harder than they expected. They had spent so much time asking why they cared about you that they had missed the more important question: what were they going to do about it? Because by then, staying silent was beginning to hurt more than the possibility of rejection. But just when they considered moving closer, something stopped them. They overheard a small piece of information about your past, nothing scandalous, nothing that changed how they saw you, but enough to explain why you guarded your heart so carefully. Suddenly, your distance made sense. The moments when you became quiet made sense. Even the sadness they had noticed during that first encounter seemed connected to something deeper. And instead of making them retreat, it made them more careful with you. They decided they wouldn't rush you, pressure you, or force themselves into your life. They would wait until you felt safe enough to let them closer. But there was one problem. While they were patiently waiting, someone else noticed their feelings for you, and that person asked them a question they could no longer avoid. The question sounded simple, but it left them completely exposed. Why do you care so much about this person? For a moment, they had no answer. They tried to laugh it off, change the subject, pretend there was nothing unusual happening. But the person asking had already noticed everything, the way your name instantly captured their attention, the way they remembered details about you, and especially the way they became protective whenever someone misunderstood you. Finally, they stopped pretending. They admitted that something had felt different from the first moment they saw you. They couldn't explain why. They only knew that before they learned your story, before they understood your personality, and before there was any reason to become emotionally invested, some part of them had already decided you mattered. But saying those words aloud forced them to confront another truth they had been avoiding. They realized their biggest fear wasn't that you might reject them. It was that they might wait so long that you would eventually believe they never cared. Think about that. While you may have interpreted their silence as indifference, they were silently debating whether approaching you would bring comfort into your life or create another complication you didn't need. They began remembering every opportunity they had missed. Every conversation they could have extended. Every time they almost told you something personal, then pulled back at the last second. And suddenly, being careful started feeling dangerously similar to hiding. That frightened them because the one thing they never wanted was for you to feel invisible around them. So they decided something had to change. Not with a dramatic confession. Not yet. They wanted to give you one small, undeniable sign that their attention toward you had never been accidental. And then the opportunity arrived sooner than expected. You were having an ordinary conversation when they noticed that familiar shift in your expression, the same tiny change they had seen during your very first encounter. Everyone else continued talking, but this person recognized it immediately. Something was bothering you. Instead of ignoring it, they quietly asked whether you were really okay. The question caught you off guard because they weren't asking casually. They were looking at you as though they genuinely wanted the truth. And when you hesitated, something inside them became certain, they had been right from the beginning. There was a part of you that wanted to be understood without having to explain everything first. But what surprised them most wasn't your hesitation. It was what you finally said next, because your answer revealed that you had noticed far more about their hidden feelings than they ever imagined. Your answer was quiet, almost cautious, but it changed the entire atmosphere between you. You admitted that you had noticed the way they watched for changes in your mood. You had noticed how they remembered things you barely remembered saying. Most importantly, you had noticed that whenever you became distant, they never demanded an explanation. They simply gave you space while somehow remaining close enough to make you feel that you weren't alone. Hearing this stunned them. All that time, they thought their feelings were safely hidden, yet you had been collecting your own small clues. Then you said something they weren't prepared for. There had been something unusual about the very first moment you saw them too. Suddenly, the memory they had replayed countless times belonged to both of you, and the question they had been afraid to ask was standing right there between you. They wanted to ask what exactly you had felt that day, but fear stopped them. What if your experience had been completely different? What if they turned one beautiful moment into something uncomfortable by asking for too much? So instead, they revealed only a small piece of their truth. They told you they remembered that first meeting more clearly than you probably realized. Your expression changed immediately. That was enough. For several seconds, neither of you needed to explain anything. And inside that silence, this person finally understood why every attempt to distance themselves had failed. Their care for you wasn't built from fantasy. It had grown stronger because each new thing they discovered about you confirmed what they sensed at the beginning. Your kindness. Your guarded heart. Your quiet strength. Even your imperfections made you feel more real to them. But one question remained. If both of you remembered that first moment so clearly, why had neither of you spoken about it until now? The answer became clearer when you finally shared something they never expected. You confessed that you had sometimes mistaken their carefulness for uncertainty. There were moments when you wondered whether they were interested in knowing you at all, because whenever the connection seemed to deepen, they suddenly became reserved. Those words hit them hard. Everything they had done to protect your comfort had accidentally created doubt. They realized silence wasn't protecting either of you anymore. It was creating a story neither of you actually wanted. And for the first time, they seriously considered telling you everything, from the instant they first saw you to the moment they realized your happiness had somehow begun to matter to them. But before they could say it, you asked one unexpected question. When did you first realize you cared about me? And the truthful answer was far earlier than you were prepared to hear. They went completely still because there was no safe answer anymore. They could have chosen a recent moment, something reasonable and easy to explain. Instead, they looked at you and quietly said, "The first time I saw you." You almost smiled, assuming they were exaggerating, but their expression didn't change. That was when you realized they meant every word. They explained that they hadn't understood the feeling at first. They only remembered seeing you and immediately wondering whether you were truly okay. It made no sense to care about someone they barely knew, which was exactly why the moment had stayed with them. And then they revealed something even more surprising. After that first encounter, they had actually tried to convince themselves to forget about you. They believed the feeling would disappear once enough time passed. But every new encounter did the opposite. Instead of fading, that strange first impression became stronger. You asked what they had noticed about you so quickly, and suddenly they became careful with their words. It wasn't one obvious thing. It was the contrast. They had seen warmth in you, but also hesitation. Confidence, but also a softness you seemed determined to protect. You could smile naturally and still carry something unspoken behind your eyes. That contradiction stayed in their mind. They wanted to know the person underneath what everyone else saw. But then they admitted something you never expected. There were moments when they deliberately avoided you because the connection was becoming too important. They feared becoming emotionally invested before knowing whether there was even a place for them in your life. So every time you wondered why they suddenly became distant, they were actually trying to regain control. The problem was that distance never brought relief. It only made them notice how much your presence had already become part of their emotional world. Then came the confession they had protected most carefully. They told you there had been one specific day when they almost approached you and revealed everything. They had rehearsed the words privately. They knew exactly what they wanted to say. That meeting you had affected them in a way they couldn't explain, and that pretending otherwise was becoming impossible. But before they reached you, they saw something that made them stop. You were talking with someone, smiling in a way that made you look genuinely comfortable, and they suddenly believed they might be too late. Instead of interrupting, they walked away. For a long time, they carried that moment as proof that perhaps they should remain silent. But what they didn't know was that the person standing beside you that day wasn't who they assumed. And once they discovered the truth about that conversation, everything changed. The truth reached them almost by accident. The person they had seen beside you wasn't someone competing for your heart, and that warm smile they had witnessed had nothing to do with a hidden romance. It had been an ordinary conversation with someone you trusted, yet from a distance, they had created an entire story around it. When they discovered how wrong they had been, relief came first. Then regret. They realized fear had been making decisions for them. How many moments had they misunderstood simply because they were afraid to ask? How many times had they stepped away when you might actually have wanted them closer? That realization forced them to reconsider everything, including the possibility that your connection had been waiting for honesty from both sides all along. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether they cared about you anymore. The question was whether they were finally brave enough to let you see how much. After that, their behavior began changing in small but unmistakable ways. They stopped disappearing whenever conversations became personal. They held your gaze a little longer. They asked questions and actually waited for the real answers. When you spoke about something important, they remembered it days later. None of this was calculated. They were simply tired of hiding behind caution. And you noticed. There was a new softness between you, but also a tension neither of you could ignore. Every conversation seemed to carry words that hadn't been spoken yet. Then one day, you mentioned your first meeting again, almost casually, and this person finally asked the question they had carried for so long: "What did you feel when you first saw me?" They expected you to hesitate. Instead, you answered almost immediately, and what you said made them realize that their first impression had never been one-sided. You told them there had been something strangely familiar about their presence. Not familiar as though you had met before, but comfortable in a way you couldn't explain. You remembered their eyes. You remembered wondering why they seemed to notice you so carefully. And when you admitted that you had thought about that first encounter afterward too, they could barely hide their reaction. For so long, they had treated their feelings like a private mystery. Now they understood that while they were replaying that moment, you had been remembering it too. But there was still one piece missing. You had never told them what happened after you walked away that first day. Something small happened when you were alone. Something that made you stop, look back, and wonder whether that person you had just met might eventually become far more important to you than either of you understood.